Turn you over to Jason Spence. Jason and I have gone back a long ways. What?
Who's counting?
Yeah, let's not. I was writing an article for a magazine about Yamaha. Had called me and said, "Hey, we've got the very first digital live sound console that we made in Nashville. It's a Yamaha PM1D." And you need to go check it out. These guys named Diamond Rio are in rehearsal, and you need to go over. And of course, Diamond Rio's like the studio I was in, where the first album was mixed, the first album in Nashville that was recorded digitally, mixed digitally, and mastered digitally.
Yeah.
And also the first country album where the debut single went #1 on the charts. The first country band. Anyway, but Jason and I met during that, so it's like there's always a Diamond Rio connection, and then
Everywhere.
there's been a Jason connection ever since. So he has gone on from there to work with numerous bands, including Amy and Vince and Megadeth, and I have to keep reminding him about that one.
Everything in between.
Everything in between, but also at the Country Music Association Awards every year, there are 2 stages, and Jason's doing monitors in a hallway ramp behind one of those every year.
Turn right at the Chicken Shack. That's where I'm at.
Exactly. At the C of A. So we have someone who's a veteran live sound monitor engineer and live sound engineer, but also has young boys at home and decided to spend a little more time with them. Started JSS, which is a full sound service company. Started out with selling products and such, but it's turned into a full design build firm with video and lighting and all of that stuff built in. And it was doing so good that Solotech bought him, because they don't like to have competition like that. So he's now part of the Solotech family with JSS as well. So I'm going to turn you over without further ado to Jason Spence.
Thanks, Frank. Because I'm a monitor guy, I'm not used to being on the screen, so can you put my presentation up? Exactly right. So imagine you're the worship leader or pastor, and you're walking on stage, and the sanctuary's full, and all the eyes are on you, and there's 5 cameras out there, and they're all pointed at you, and you're live on a broadcast, and the worship band behind you's leading, and you get ready to start the song. Can't hear you. Now what? So when Frank asked me to do this, I do a lot of mixing, commercially, award shows, touring, but a lot of it is at my church on Sunday, mixing monitors from front of house. So what is mixing monitors? It's at a church. It's making sure that it's an integral part to making sure that you're not a distraction to what's supposed to be going on. And if the worship leader can't hear himself, or somebody in the band can't hear themselves, then they're distracted from delivering their message, which is, of course, supposed to be leading people to God eventually, right? So don't be a distraction. That's what mixing monitors is. Sorry, I'm going to make my way back over to stage left in the dark. So Frank pointed out, I'm now the director of integration at Solotech. We do a lot of integration, a lot of live production. So anything from the Cirque du Soleil to Nashville Predators to... No, I'm supposed to be in the dark over here. To mixing at my own church. Long before that, I spent many years on a tour bus and on planes going around the planet, mixing everyone from, as Frank pointed out, from Amy Grant to Megadeth, Keith Urban, Anita Baker, lots of different stuff, and then trying to get off the road so that my kids and wife knew who I was. Started mixing TV. Was actually part of the SNL 40th anniversary special that we won an Emmy for, so I was proud of that. Mixed the Super Bowl, NHL All-Star Games, NBA, CMA, so there's my qualifications for talking today about mixing monitors. And actually, side note, because you brought up so many stories in my head. So I think the PM1D, somebody told me it's still installed here at Belmont. Anybody, yeah, you're confirming that? So I actually installed that and trained the staff and that semester students on how to use that thing, and it's still working. So amazing. Today, I'm going to talk about mixing wedges versus mixing ear monitors. Stage volume, which I think we had some questions on that already, talking about the electronic drums. What's in the mix? How do I build those mixes? Using personal monitors, and then ambience, and then we'll leave some time for question and answer at the end. I'd also encourage, though, if you had some questions, man, shout it out, please. Definitely don't want to just be making eyes glaze over. So, what was our friend's name here before me? Tony. Is he still here? So I thought he stole my slide for a second. He started talking about ingredients. By show of hands, you got a grandmother or something that makes famous cookies or something, or a pie or something, right? So, just like mixing, I'm going to make some assumptions. We're going to talk about outputs and mixing. But before you ever push an output up, you got to use gain structure. You got to know signal flow. You got to understand EQ. Before you ever touch a knob, you've moved the microphone, right? That's your first form of EQ. So although we're talking about monitors, you cannot get a good mix of front of house monitors, broadcast, wherever, unless you get your ingredients right. So you always got to start at the source. Okay, maybe next time I'll get a clicker at least. So wedges versus ear monitors. So what's the benefits? I know at my church, I've got a range in ages from 20s to mid 50s. Our worship pastor used to sing for the Imperials. He does not want to wear ears. He wants wedges. I've got guys that I've actually toured with. Some guys, Chris Rodriguez, who I toured with on Keith Urban, and Amy Grant, he comes in and plays. He wants to use an amplifier. It's a small room. It's only 400 seats. So what are you going to do? You got to keep control of that stage volume. But we'll talk about that. But the biggest thing is understand the benefits of both, right? So wedges, a lot of people say those feel more natural to them. You feel more connected to the congregation or the audience. They're pretty simple to maintain. Plug it in. It's either self-powered or plugs into an amplifier. Pretty simple. And hopefully you're not at a church especially too loud that you're actually blowing these things up too often. Disadvantages. Big one. This is the big one for me. Stage volume. Hearing health. Definitely. Not just for the person in the room, but all the people in the room, because now your front of house mix has to get up over the stage volume. And they take up a lot of space. So I know on a lot of the TV shows, they'll have a light fixture right here that's moved and painted gold, and then I have a floor monitor, and then the producer always complains about the floor monitor. I don't understand it, but same thing on broadcast for churches. A lot of times we want that nice clean stage look, so people complain about floor monitors. Ear monitors. Easier to hear yourself and others on the stage. Definitely lower stage volume. Freedom to move around. So unless you're Garth Brooks or Kenny Rogers or Rolling Stones and can afford to have duplicate stereo ear mixes anywhere on the stage and out on wherever you're going, then you're not going to have the freedom to move around like you would if you're on ears. Definitely hearing health, although I do know some artists that listen way louder than they should and even louder than the stage monitor. In general, most people are going to listen at a lower level with ear monitors. Biggest disadvantage that I hear is they feel disconnected from the audience or disconnected from the congregation. So when you see, pull the ear out. There's always one ear out, always one ear out. So one of the things that we'll talk about coming up is ambience. But they also require a lot more maintenance. Anybody ever have their church complain or somebody complain about their ears dropping out? Yeah. Yes. And then you discover it's that little tiny center pin on the BNC that looks like it's fine, but it's really not. Or when it heats up and expands and contracts, and so sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it does. It takes more maintenance. You got to be on top of it, technically more for ears. All right, stage volume. That's the number one thing that I think, especially for a church, is a benefit for going with ears. Besides the stage volume alone, this room obviously is pretty damped in the high end especially, so we're not having a lot of problems, but I would bet, a lot of the churches I've been to, that's just not the case. It's sheetrock, single layer, snare drum, as Tony pointed out, coming off the stage with no PA on is over 90 dB, and then you got to add in the rest of the amps, the rest of the band's instruments, and I don't know any guitar player that doesn't want to set their amp there. So, any guitar players in here? Yeah, you guys, that's what I'm talking about. So, but just the acoustics, right? So, when your stage volume is going up, you're turning up the front of house mix, you're turning up wedges, and ears included, right? We're trying to get up over just the noise floor and the noise in the room. Well, if you're energizing the room like that, you also get what's called masking. So now you're trying to carve EQs out to get rid of low mids that are building up in the room. There's just lots of bad things that are happening as you continue to increase your stage volume, especially in smaller spaces. So if the purpose is to remove distractions, then we need to be diligent about communicating with our worship team. Encourage lower stage volumes, and hey, I love putting a microphone on a guitar amp. I've gotten to mix some of the greatest guitar players living, and there's no substitute for guitar and a guitar amp and a microphone or a couple of microphones. But at church, what are you there for? It's not really about me, right? So, is a Kemper okay? Is a line 6? Is there some other choices that get the job done, but help keep that noise floor down so that we can get a message out? All right, so what's in the mix? I'll start with wedges. So the first thing that I do when I'm mixing floor monitors is I'll actually try to balance out what I'm hearing. So if it's a two-way monitor, for instance, I'll just run peak noise at a moderate level. Don't need to be crushing it, don't need it too low, or as it increases in volume, then what we hear and perceive in our ear changes, right? So moderate level, and I try to balance usually the lows are wide open, and I'll end up backing down the high channel a few dB until that feels nice and smooth. If you don't have a two-way monitor and you're using a passive monitor, then you can always take a shelf EQ on your top end and just start shelving it down a couple dB. I don't encourage narrow filters. Use steep, nice contours to shelf that, just to bring it down and balance it out. And the more balanced that monitor sounds just with pink noise. Now, everybody knows what pink noise is? No? Somebody else. What's pink noise? Equal energy, equal amplitude, right? All frequencies. So at all octaves, thank you. So if I listen to pink noise, you got a pink noise generator? So if I get a pink noise, he was like, crap, man, I thought I'm going to take a break. So when you bring pink noise up, you start to balance things out. And if it's not hurting your ear, then it's pretty good, right? If it sounds really thin and nasally, okay, well, maybe I need to, Tony talked about subtractive EQ. I'm not necessarily going to boost my lows because my low channel is probably wide open, but I'm going to start bringing the highs down until I have a nice, smooth sound to my ear. I'm gonna keep moving here, but we'll come back to that. Just turn it. Go ahead. There you go. Oh, that was music. All right. So put a high shelf on there. He's on the spot now. This is kind of fun being the worship pastor. Turn me up. Turn me down. How many worship pastors? None? Oh, you're getting armed with info. Great. So as I'm listening, that's fairly smooth. Sounds like there's a couple of narrow, steep filters in there. But put a shelf on it and just start. All right, that's a shelf up. So start. So if it sounded like the first thing when I turned it on, right, I'm like, yeah, okay, that's a little painful. Start smoothing it out. That's pink noise. Make sure. Do you have a high pass or low pass filter on that pink noise? Okay. Make sure that, yeah, just do that real quick so people know you don't want it to sound like that, right? So as he starts taking all that process, those EQs off, it starts smoothing out. That's what you're trying to do. That sounds pretty close there. So if it's a two-way monitor, you could just turn down the amplifier channel on the high channel. If it's a passive monitor, that means the crossover's in there, and it's a 1 amp channel, then you can just shelf it. It's an EQ. And when you do that, and it's balanced, then I could walk in front of it, and it's not going to feed back, right? But if that high channel was wide open, I'll put a headset in a wedge. I'm not scared. So no different, right? So if the pastor likes to hear himself, just balance out those monitors. Make sure that it sounds relatively close to your ear. You'll probably be okay. So you go up too loud and start feeding back and all that. So don't do that. EQ. So narrow filters versus contours. We started hearing that, as we, really narrow filter. Our ear, we want to hear a nice smooth contour, right? Narrow filters to our ear is perceived as distortion. So when do I use a narrow filter compared to nice shelves for contours? Well, the shelves and contours are like we talked about. I'm going to balance my top end to the bottom end, my lows to the highs. But inevitably, you're going to have something either in the room, usually a low frequency that'll resonate. You could find that a couple different ways. You can get a vocal mic and just start going, stepping down through notes, and you'll hit one, and the room will vibrate. That one I'll probably notch and take out just enough to make it stop. If you're in a floor monitor, I would do the same thing with a microphone. I don't like using the word ring out the monitors. I just stopped doing that. Most of the time I have a pretty decent floor wedge to work with. But when I first started out with monitors, I would suck the life out of it. I would get every single frequency that could possibly feed back. Well, and then it looks like this, right? And I pulled everything down. It sounds terrible, absolutely horrible. And what did I do? I just turned down the whole output of the system. I have no gain either. So take out the resonant frequencies. Take out maybe a frequency or two that's causing a problem, maybe some ringing on your vocal mics, and then leave it alone. Leave it as flat as you can, as smooth as you can. And when it sounds good, also doesn't have to be as loud. Usually you bring it up and go, oh, that's good. That's great, It doesn't matter whether I'm pulling up a vocal or a guitar or bass or piano. Smooth contours. All right. So there's no worship pastors that raise their hand. So everybody do audio in here? Okay. So monitors, either from front of house or okay. So when you're dialing in the monitors, is the house on or is it off? By show of hands, off. Okay. By show of hands, on. By show of hands, both. When? Why? So Generally speaking, when I first listen, I'm going to listen to the monitor by itself because I want to hear what that thing's doing. But understand, this is making noise, and it's really weird, but what it sounds like on that side and what it sounds like on that side don't sound anything like each other. But guess what side's pointed at the audience? That side. That thing sounds pretty good out there, but behind it, I hear this. So that thing sounds a whole lot different than that does in the front. And guess what? You're putting both of them in the room. So eventually I got to see what that sounds like. So, okay. Nate, there was a show at the Houston Rodeo. Is anybody from Texas here? Yeah, I know you've been in there. So big, giant, huge, dirty arena. And the reverb time in there, do you remember what it used to be like? It was like 6 seconds or something. I mean, it was insane. And I was in there mixing the band Alabama on wedges. And I remember the keyboard player, he's waving at me. So I come up on stage. Yeah. Man, I don't even know what to tell you. And he starts playing it. It's like, oh, yeah, hold on a second. So I got on the radio, called the front of house guys, hey, turn the house on. Okay, now play. Bone crushing came down on him. He said, never mind, just leave it. So by itself, it sounded absolutely horrible because I pretty much high passed it up to like 400 hertz. So it was very painful to the ear without the house on, but you combined it with the house. Okay, now I'm not saying it sounded good, but at least you could get through the night. So you got to eventually listen to it with the house on because that's what it's ultimately going to sound like. And then, sometimes I'll ask the house guy to turn things off or on if I'm trying to find a specific problem. I might have to mute the house, but in general, leave the house on while you're checking because that's what it's going to sound like. Polarity. Anybody ever flip the polarity on their wedges? By show of hands? Pretty good trick, huh? So, those speakers are pointed that way. That speaker's pointed that way. Now they're 180 degrees out of phase. Sorry, out of polarity. I got corrected, many times. Big dummy. At least I'm at AES and get it confused. So flipping the polarity on that thing all of a sudden makes that disappear. Have you ever done it in the ears, in ear monitors? Yeah, works with ear monitors too. So not always, but if you stand there, hold a note, if it's kind of mushy sounding and it's just kind of coming from everywhere, you can't tell where the heck that vocal is supposed to be coming out of a monitor, then hold a note, ask the front of house guy to flip the polarity on that while you're holding that note, and you'll hear it either pop up or disappear, and it's pretty quick. It's not subtle, but it's a good way to get your vocals, especially, to pop out of a floor monitor without turning them up. Sometimes it's just it's a phasey, smeary mess. So there's a good tip, both for ears and floor monitors. Okay, so now I've got my monitors balanced. They're either in polarity or out of polarity. They may it's a nice, smooth, gentle contour. I've gotten rid of room resonance. Now I'm ready to actually start putting in some instruments into the floor monitor. That's again assuming you've done all those other things right on the ingredients, on your sources. So what do I put in there? As little as possible. So number one, something for pitch. So you got to be able to localize, pull something for pitch. So maybe a keyboard or an acoustic guitar. I'm not big on low frequency pads that get washy and swishy in there. It's kind of hard to pull pitch from that. So pianos, acoustic guitars, things like that. Time. So got to be able to keep in time even on a smaller stage. Again, I'm only putting in as much as I need, but got to have something for time. Maybe a little bit of kick, a little bit of snare, and maybe a little bit of hi-hat. It's rare that I've ever, especially in small stages, that I ever put much more than a little kick, snare, and hat. By the way, on the snare, it's top snare. Putting the bottom snare in a wedge, man, it could get painful. So be careful with that. And then, of course, the last thing is, me, put myself on top. If I'm a vocalist, I'm going to start there, and I'm going to pull those other things up around that. Throughout the service, you'll get this, right? So at some point, there is no more that. It's gone. So sometimes, and Tony touched on this too, but subtractive EQ, same thing with wedges. Maybe it's not about turning more vocal up, but maybe everything else has gotten louder around them, bringing some of that stuff down. So it's pretty simple. It's as minimal as possible, but make those wedges sound good, get them smooth, get rid of room resonance, give them some pitch, give them some time, and then a healthy dose of themselves, and you'll probably be okay. If you have multiple wedge mixes, most wedges are, pretty, I don't know, what are these? How wide are these? Oh, they're busy. Sorry, guys. Do you know how wide these are? Like 60 by 40? So if I'm standing right here, I'm probably going to be able to hear that. So keep in mind, too, as you're bringing instruments up in, they're going to hear what's around them. It's one big environment. So make sure you walk out on stage and listen. If you can walk out there with an iPad or something like that, it's even better. Something about as I'm mixing, this is really true of front of house or monitors or broadcast or whatever. You got to be aware of this. Anybody know what Fletcher-Munson curves are? If you don't, I won't glaze your eyes over, but you should understand this. So our ear at lower volumes, as you increase that SPL, the contour changes. So remember what I said at the beginning, you don't want the pink noise too quiet, because then when you start putting instruments in it, it might sound wrong. Have a moderate level, because as that SPL increases, what the ear perceives changes. I'm going to throw up another slide that summarizes that a little bit better. But you can have a lot more SPL. This is what the ear perceives as flat. So that's another pet peeve of mine. It's almost as bad as the phase and polarity. Oh, this sounds flat. Flat. It's horrible. Flat sounds terrible most of the time. I want it to sound smooth. I want it to sound even. So understanding those Fletcher-Munson curves is important as you're building your mix, EQing, and just balancing, whether floor monitors or house. One more quick slide. So again, the blue line is with an SPL of 40 dB, 80 dB at the red, and the pink is 120. So it starts getting closer, between 80 and 120, and hopefully you're not mixing your service at 120. That's the Spirit of God there. So I was off one Sunday, and a buddy of mine filled in, and there was an older gentleman that came up with his cane, and they're whack! So it sounds like the devil in here. So watch your SPL. But on that note, you can mix at a lower level, right? So I generally mix between 88 and 92 dB, and it feels pretty full. It's not, that's at church, by the way. Yeah, thanks. Not at Megadeth, no. It was a little bit louder than that. But 88 to 92 dB, it is pretty comfortable. It's pretty full. But thinking of the Fletcher-Munson curve, think of what our human hearing wants to hear. I could have pretty nice full bottom end, right? Even I'm going to pick on you a little bit. But even on my voice, can you lower the high pass filter on my voice? I know I don't have that's probably a lot, but even if you left it there and instead of high passing, just shelf the low end. And one thing that you'll start to hear is that it may have gotten a little bit muddy, but he'll get that shelf engaged, and we perceive distance with low frequency, right? So you don't want to thin out the pastor, because by the end of everybody's shoulders are like this and irritated with the pastor. Make it sound nice and full and big, and keep that low end in there. And you can have more low end and make it sound fuller, and the ear will be just fine with that. Before I move on from this, any questions on Fletcher Munson or the... Nope? Okay. All right. So, ear monitors. So that was wedges. That was kind of just something to be aware of with your Fletcher Munson curves, SPLs. Ear monitors. What am I putting in a ear mix? So, anybody monitoring in stereo for their ear monitors? Anybody monitoring in mono for their ear monitors? Is it mono because of budget? Okay. All right. So, sometimes circumstances are you just budget. I've had other instances where way more people have showed up than said they were going to be there, and I've had to mono out mixes. But if I have to mix ears and I'm doing mono, I'm going to take more of a minimalistic approach to ears in mono. So some pitch, some time, and myself. I'm going to treat it more like a wedge mix because if you start putting, as you probably already know, you start putting more and more and more and more inside of a mono mix, there's just not room. And now it's just a complete, it's horrible. It's not good. So I'll do way more minimal mixing for mono. Stereo. So how many ears do we have? All right. So mono is not really natural. So even though I'm talking, I am a mono source, technically, from here. You're hearing binaurally, right? You're hearing what's around you. You're hearing with both ears. So it's pretty unnatural to do mono. So I always try, if I can, to do mixing in stereo. I need a higher res version of that. Sorry. Talk to my friends at the Neumann site. So you can spread things around in a stereo ear mix. You can turn things down in a stereo ear mix. Much like the wedge, I'm going to start with putting my vocal. Probably if I'm a vocalist, I'm going to put that up at 0, and then I'm going to start pulling my mix up around that. You can place things around the ear mix. And if I take let's say, I don't know who has steel guitar. I actually have steel guitar once in a while. It's odd, but man, that thing can be really annoying in the ears. But you got to be able to hear it. Pan it way over to one side, maybe double it up, and double patch it. Put some Haas delay on it. Put it on the other side, and you can have that at a really low level. And somebody up front will hear like it, or sound like it's way in the back there, but it's still in their mix. A lot of people ask, how do you know what to put in ear monitors? Honestly, I don't ever ask. I do this pre-dial. And that is, I learned that from doing the TV, where it's literally thousands of dollars per minute when you walk on stage and an artist can't hear. It turns out it works well at church too. So if a band member walks out, they've never played before with the band, maybe you just bought a new monitor system, If you're the tech, don't let them walk out on stage without you listening to that and done a pre-dial. And so the pre-dial is literally whatever their instrument is on top. So if it's vocal, I'm putting that at 0. If they've got an acoustic guitar, I'm probably putting that 5 or 6 dB underneath that vocal. If it's drums, I'm panning that around. If it's I've got a piano player over there and an organ player over here, I'm probably going to put a piano player over there in the ears and an organ player over here. Pan those things around. Have it pre-dialed so when they walk out, they can actually start playing. It also does a lot for confidence, right? If back to that statement, man, it's nothing worse than walking in, putting some ears in, and go to play, and you don't have anything. Can't communicate, can't hear your bandmates. Get them to a starting place. It may not be perfect. The pre-dial is literally a pre-dial. It's a starting place. That's it. But it's a way better starting place than silence. So always do a pre-dial. That pre-dial is opposite of what I would do in a wedge or a mono ear. I'm going to treat that more like a Studio 2 mix. You have this unique opportunity to actually mix and not just do damage control with mixing monitors for ears. Take advantage of that. So get in there and build that band mix. And even before you've heard the band, we're like, wait a minute, how can we turn stuff up in people's ears and we haven't even heard the instrument yet? Well, because you're going to use proper gain structure and you understand how to balance something, that when you set the gain on that vocal, you can unmute it and you're ready and you're quick. But it's not set the gain, unmute it, now turn it up in everybody's mix, right? It takes too long. So go and pre-dial all of this. It doesn't have to be perfect. Make it as good as it can be, but then once you start using gain structure and turning channels on, things will just pop right up. Panning, with few exceptions, I'll pan the band around just like we talked about, based on where they're at, where instruments are at on the stage. There's one thing, though, that I'll do with individual instruments, and I brought it up a little bit, but it is, I'm going to skip to the Haas effects. So, anybody know what the Haas effect is? The train that goes flying by, it sounds like the pitch is changing. Again, it's perceiving distance. Well, as I move around, things sound different to me where they're at because my brain is localizing where these reflections are coming from. So it's if you take a mono input from a guitar, so you have 157 on a bad cat amplifier. If you turn that up in the guitar player's ears, it's going to sound okay. They're probably going to be okay with that. But if you double patch that, pan one 50%, the other one 50%, put about 7 milliseconds of delay on one side, rebalance it, because now that side's going to sound about 3 dB difference at least. All of a sudden, they're playing their guitar, and it feels like they're right in front of it, instead of this ice pick that's just drilling me right in the middle of my head. One of the things that so I've heard Paul McCartney said it's not nice to name drop, but I'm going to do it anyway. So Keith Urban was on stage. We were getting ready to start the show, and he always liked to noodle with his amp. And he's up there, and all of a sudden the tracks start, which has the click track and the count off, and he quickly scrambles to go put his ears in, but he already had his ears in. And he looks over and he starts laughing. I'm like, oh, okay, that's a pretty good trick. So same thing. He felt like, even though it was one mono input, he came off the stage, he's like, how are you doing that? I'm giving you a mono guitar amp. And I can't tell you, because then you'd want to mix monitors. So it really does. It makes it so that it feels more natural. And I'll do that to the steel guitar, the electric guitars a lot. But I usually only do that to that one person's guitar, because if I have a lot of people on stage, I keep all the other instruments in mono and spread it around like I'm mixing a record, but relative to where they're at on stage. All right, I'm going to go back to reverb. So everybody's in audio in here. Everybody's mixing. Has everybody actually listened to any of their ear mixes? Yes? I'm so glad. No. You should do it. Because then maybe you'll go, oh, that's really bad. No wonder they're bad every week. So, or, wow, that's pretty good. I don't know what they're complaining about. If you're a vocalist and you put ears in, you've now isolated, right, from all the reflections in the room, which is exactly what you're trying to achieve with ear monitors, except for it's completely unnatural. We don't like direct sound, and it's I've seen it where it actually affects somebody's pitch. So it's rare that I'll have any vocalist on rare occasion that they don't want some sort of reverb on their voice. It doesn't need to be swimming. Oftentimes, I actually try to match the reverb of the room I'm in, unless I'm literally trying to do a specific effect, because all you're trying to do is give them some space in their head. So I'll use ambient mics and or reverb, and sparingly, just enough to give them a sense of space. I had one artist, and she had never worn ear monitors before. She put them in, and everything was muted on the console, and she was about to fall over. She got vertigo. I'm like, oh shoot, hold on a second. And I unmuted my audience mics, and she stood back up. Oh, that was weird. What was that? So you got to have a sense of space in the ears, or it's really unnatural. Same thing with an acoustic guitar. Anybody listen to acoustic guitar in the ears? Is it without reverb on it? Not usually very pleasant, you know. Sounds like an ice pick, you know. So put a little bit of reverb on it. It's usually short. I don't want it getting in the way of my mix necessarily, but I want to make it feel like they're inside of maybe a small room or a large room, whatever. But give them a sense of space. And those direct instruments, unless it's a keyboard or a synth, they're going to be pretty unnatural without some ambience going on. So reverb is your friend. Any questions on reverb and how I use it and anything on that? Yes. Right. So generally speaking, I usually start with ambience first. I have my reverb pre-dialed, so all I got to do is quickly turn the send on, and then it's there. But generally, I'll try to use as many audience mics as I can. We'll get to audience mics, but in general, I'm going to try to make it feel like the space by miking the space and putting it in the ears. And then I'll augment that a little bit with the reverb. Yeah, so oftentimes if it's a small, just terrible sounding room, then I'll just have fun with it. What sounds good. But if it's a larger hall and it sounds pretty good, then I'll try to lean more on those audience mics. And then I'm using my judgment somewhere in between to use. I don't know. I'm usually maybe somewhere between anywhere short as 1.8 to 2.4, just depending on the tempo of the song and what the room sounds like. But yeah, I'm usually trying to emulate the space first, so it makes it feel like they're not wearing ears. Now, if it's a band and it's a pop band and there's lots of delays and lots of over-the-top effects, then I'm actually trying to introduce effects, then obviously I'll use those on vocals. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, you definitely have problems with that. So you guys are skipping ahead to my next slide. Hold on a second. Stand by. Where is that? All right, we'll go straight to that. Actually, that's fine. So audience mics, that's probably one of the most common questions I get is where do you put them? What ones do you use? And rarely does anybody ask how many, but that's usually I say, well, how many do you have? What do you mean, how many do you have? So I'll often have a pair outside of the stage, and I'll usually put a pair in the center, and those will be panned relative to how the band is standing on stage. That gives you some localization on stage for the musicians. And then I want to bring the room in, right? And so I'll have as many as as many as your budget will allow me to put in. At least six over the audience. And there's different ways you could do that. You could put at a church, like you do hanging choir mics sometimes because nobody wants to see them. They usually cost a little less than shotguns. If I am using shotguns, one of the worst things I see with people using shotguns is they'll put a shotgun mic on stage and they'll aim it right at Frank, and then Frank starts screaming, and it sounds really weird in the ears. Sorry, Frank. So if you're using a shotgun mic, that's fine. Get it up high and aim it towards the back. So on the broadcasts, we use a lot of shotguns, but they're never aimed at anybody. They're aimed up high and back towards the room. So you don't want to hear somebody talking. I'm trying to literally capture what the room sounds like. And then I'll build a composite out of that. So 6 to 12 microphones, and I'll listen and balance it, and I'll use contour EQs, keep it nice and smooth from my ear. I'll carve things that are in the room, just like the wedges that you found that resonant note in the house or in your floor monitors. Well, it's probably in that room mic too, so you can dig some of that out and then I'll push that up into the mics or into the ear mix. So it's always open. I almost always have them open. And then from there, that's on my pre-dial. I have a nice composite, and depending on how good the room is, you can really push the audience mics and leave them up loud. If it's a challenging room, which most rooms are, you tuck those down a little bit. But yeah, that's generally how I use the mics. 2 different ways: on the front for localization if somebody's talking, but then also I want to bring the room into the ears to make it feel like a natural space. Not usually, only because that timing issue you talked about, now it's aimed at the PA. That's where your timing issue is coming from. It's probably, you have some latency, obviously, by the time it goes through the console and through the PA and then back into the microphone. So I'm trying to keep the null of whatever mic I'm using aimed at any source that's, I don't want anything direct. I want it very, very, I want ambient. I don't want to hear the PA. If I'm recording, sometimes I'll put a stereo mic out at front of house and record, and sometimes that'll end up in there, but not usually. It's mostly indirect ambient mics. Any other questions on reverb or ambience? Okay. Hey, good job. You guys are hired. Personal mixers. I love these things because it makes my job easier. Heck yeah. Yeah, I use these all the time, and whether it's even on tour, one of the bands that I did was David Foster, and he would have there'd be like 6 million people on stage, and it was just impossible to keep everybody in the band happy. So I would use a personal monitor system. So what does that look like input wise to that, or my outputs from the console? I'll have some things direct, like pastors, or a pastor mic might be direct. I might have a pastor bus where if you have a few different people that just walk up and grab mics and put that all into a bus. A bass guitar, that would probably be direct. If I only have one keyboard, maybe that's direct. And then I'll build stems for some of the other things. So a left to right drum stem, keyboard stems, uh, background vocals. And again, I'm trying to do stereo as much as I can and keep those stems balanced so that all the musicians have to do is grab that up or down. Same with those ambient mics. That's generally going to be on a fader, on a personal mixer. But in general, yeah, I definitely use these. At church, sometimes the front line, the worship team, the singers, the worship pastor, maybe I'll mix them. A guest, I might mix them so that they're not walking on stage going, I don't know how to use this thing, and they're poking it, trying to get it to work. So a lot of times I'll mix the guest from front of house or from monitors. But then generally, I'm putting the band on these personal mixers. Wireless versus wired. If you're sitting there and not moving, just be on a wire. It's way easier, less problems. I don't have to deal with all the RF problems that I got to deal with anyway with microphones. Cost is usually less. So put as many as you can on a wired mix, and then any that need it, and I'll make those wireless. Any questions on personal mixers? How to use them? Pretty self-explanatory. Yeah. So my general rule is, well, how do you know what to put in their mix? Well, you don't ask; you just give it to them. And Frank had asked, is there any starting place? Same thing. If I'm mixing somebody's monitors, they're gonna walk up. There's gonna be something there. Is it gonna be perfect? Maybe not. It's gonna be pretty close. Same thing with personal mixers. Go up there and run some. If you have the luxury of being able to do like a virtual sound check, like you can on the Digico consoles, you can do that on the Yamaha consoles. There's a bunch of consoles, right? That you can do virtual sound checks. Run those tracks and go pre-dial that stuff. So walk in and get the balance right. When you're doing a balance from front of house on a drum track, if it's just left and right, what that sounds like at front of house compared to whatever corner that drummer's stuck in, it's probably going to sound different. So you might have to do some EQ on that personal mixer for them. But yes, to answer your question, no musician ever walks on my stage without being able to hear something unless I've messed something up. So always pre-dial, whether you're mixing it or they have a personal mixer. And all these mixers, you can save a profile, or a preset. So always start there. Just a general balance. And then if you have things already panned for them, when they walk on stage, all they got to do is push themselves up, or you've already done that for them. Yeah, always pre-dial. Your worship team will be appreciative. This one, we kind of already talked about this, but ambience, you got to have it in there. If your budget only allows 2 mics, do 2 mics. I've had instances where I lost to 1 and I only had 2. I'll do the double patch trick and put some delay on one side. It's not right, but it sure helps. And it's still better than just mono straight up the middle with an ambient mic, because it just gets right in the way of whatever the primary channel is you're trying to listen to, whether it's a vocal. But always do ambience. I'll talk a little bit more about ambience too, and EQing that. So obviously you're going to use gain structure, proper gain structure, so you're going to gain those mics up. You're going to balance it, but as you start bringing things in, it's going to start to get kind of muddy, especially in the low mids of the room. So just start shelving that stuff out. Use your high pass filter, and then as the band is playing, act like you're mixing a live record or a live DVD or a live stream, whatever you call it now.
And what do you call it now? Are they records? I don't know. My kids are like, "What the heck's a record, Dad?" Um, so keep the ambience out of the way of your mix, and sometimes you got to contour stuff. There's some one of the things that you can use. There's a tool in broadcast. We use a lot of the DN360 or 3000 noise. Um, it'll clean up some of that. Try to say clean up that ambience, but it'll tighten up that ambience. I don't know. Is anybody from Digico in here? No. There's something on the Yamaha desks. That's why I asked if anybody from Digico is in here. Just kidding, Matt. So there's it's like the DN360 that Yamaha just came out with. Is there anything standard on the Digico desk? I'm spoiled with great broadcast mixers when they send me their stems. It's already done, but it's on the D Live. There you go. So what's that? What's it called? Oh, that makes sense. Does it? Okay. So, yep. So proportional EQ on the Allen and Heath D Lives, all of them. So you gotta show me that because use that on your on those ambient mics and that ambient stem, and I usually put it across the bus because I don't want to chew it up for every channel, and I don't feel like turning that many knobs either. So build your bus and then put that across your bus, and that really helps clean up that those ambient mics, and you can start to push those louder and louder in the ears. Feels more and more comfortable. Proportional EQ. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you EQ the ambient mics with nobody in the sanctuary of the church?
Sure.
And it be about what it should be whenever people are in there? Or will you have to change it?
I would say with some experience, yeah. You could do some pre-dialing on that. You think about the bandwidth of your audience, right? That 500 to 2 to 4K, right? So stuff below that you can really start to get rid of. Stuff above that, maybe you want the air as a reverb. Maybe you want it to go away because you want to use an effect. But yeah, you could definitely start to do that. I would definitely still energize the room. Maybe play a talking track. Maybe play a track with some crowd noise through the PA, so you can at least hear what the room's going to sound like when it starts getting energized. And you probably already have a pretty good idea of what your room sounds like and where that resonant frequency is of the room, where you want to get rid of that too. Yeah.
Maybe more of like a psychology issue than monitor mixing.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for how to convince an instrumentalist that they don't need to hear everything?
Yes. So Belmont has a psychology department, and no, I'm just kidding. Actually, I don't know. They probably do. So there's a guy that I met recently. His name's Martin Woodley. Take this down. You want to look this guy up. If you're at church, he does training. His name is Martin Woodley. The guy is his resume. Talk about name dropping. I mean, do you know Martin Woodley? I'm surprised. He has cut records with Stevie Wonder and Amy Grant, and I mean, just he's got a who's who. Even Paul McCartney won't name drop around him. It's crazy. So, but he moved back here from LA, and he's doing. He's a believer. He just wants to train churches, and like all the things that we do, Solotech and JSS did. Whenever we do an installation, there's never enough training, right? And one of the biggest things that I hate walking away, even though we've done the training, is there just needs to always be more. And he's developed this program. He calls it the 3 C's. And there's clarity, which has to do with gain structure and signal flow. And there's communication. So I'm taking a long way to answer your question, but that communication is critical. So what you're not allowed to do in court is lead the witness, right? But when you're talking to them sometimes, and a musician, and you know what's happened, they're getting to this point where everything's up. Every fader on the personal mixer's all the way up. It's like, well, no wonder you can't hear anything. It's start asking, what do you want to hear? What's bothering you? Anyway, back to Mark Woodley, and it's Woodlee. He does a great series and training on communication and just how to communicate with the band. Because, look, we don't want to fight with them. We're on the same team, and in fact, I'm doing another one tomorrow at 1:30 with Chris Clayton from Gateway Church. It's productive rehearsals and sound checks. So we'll talk about a lot of that in that session. But you have to have mutual respect for each other. You come in as a sound guy, you're always going to be looked at, a little bit down the nose and an eyebrow raised. You got to earn the respect. But instead of this approach, which sometimes it comes to that, you don't want it to, but you got to communicate and ask leading questions. Hey man, have you ever tried maybe this? Can I help you? Okay. Here. Oh, yeah. You got to work on the approach, and maybe that's just looking in the mirror sometimes. Okay, God, give me the patience to talk to Susie today, and practice that. And I'm not kidding, because there's no Susie on my team. I didn't use her real name. So,
Thank you, Jason. Thanks to Jason. Everybody give Jason a good hand. We appreciate you being here.
We'll have.
Yeah.
If you want to see it in this presentation, I think. Did I see Luke come in? Is this link up and working?
It will be when Thursday.
And
Okay,
send it to
so-
me as well, and I'll send links to everybody at the
Okay,
end too,
great.
with others. And another point on the on communication with the sound team too. Tonight, our final session too. We'll actually show a team working together that does work together every week. Common goals, good communication, and it's a good and perhaps questions to them about how they pull that off, and that includes the sound guy too.